Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really happy to be sharing the stage with Victoria and also Vicky. My abiding memory of Vicky was at a meeting on the 14th floor of the Treasury 7 or 8 years ago. I think there must have been 100 people in the room. Vicky was chairing the meeting as Deputy Chief Executive of the Treasury. And an unfortunate individual made a comment that did not please Vicky. And I remember she stopped the meeting and I remember her banging her pen on the table when she said, "We will be sending advice that's rigorous." And I thought, what a great speech. Keep making that speech. When I hear that word rigor, and we've heard it a few times over the last day, I think of questions like, what's the problem? What's in scope? What's out of scope? What does success look like? And who's accountable? I think those are interesting questions on difficult problems like how to reduce emissions. What I'd like to do today is try to boil down the emissions problem to its absolute simplest form and then talk about what we've received from the Climate Change Commission in its report. I think the overarching idea here is to talk about the value of having one objective and the cost of trying to do too much. What I find on complicated issues is the value of a question that cuts through all the complexity. In housing, a good question is, does this policy make it easier to build a house? And I think in climate change, a similar question or helpful question is, does this policy cut emissions competitively? And competitively is an important word because we have options for how and where we cut emissions, and we should always prefer to cut more emissions more effectively. New Zealand's has set emissions targets. We've got two main targets under the Paris Climate Agreement and a target of net zero emissions in 2050. And of course we should meet those targets because we're good international citizens. These are net emissions targets, and that means gross emissions from your car, from livestock, minus removals from trees, for example. Now the beauty of emissions targets is that they cut through all of the complexity and they boil our obligation down to two numbers: how many tonnes we can emit and the date it has to happen by. Carbon dioxide is like a commodity. You can define it, you can measure it, you can attach an instrument to it, and then you can cap it and you can tax it. You can trade the instrument to find how and where to reduce emissions at least cost. And we should cut emissions at least cost because the benefit to the climate is independent of how and where we cut emissions. In other words, a tonne of carbon is a tonne of carbon. Paying $10 to reduce a tonne of emissions instead of paying $1 lowers your national income by $9 on average. Emissions policies vary enormously in their performance. Right now, the government can take a tonne of carbon out of the atmosphere for less than $70 in some places. In other places, it's paying more than $30,000 to take a tonne out. The consequences of that is that second-best emissions policies are a lot worse than first-best. And the consequence of that is that allowing non-emissions objectives to enter your decision on how and where you cut emissions comes with an enormous emissions penalty. And the Climate Change Commission is a good example of that problem. So I'm going to get to their report shortly, but before that I want to talk about the power of a systems approach to reducing emissions, and specifically the power of emissions accounting. And to illustrate, I'm going to borrow an example from the Commission's report. The Commission worries that forest fires mean that trees may not be a permanent store of carbon, which is a perfectly reasonable concern. But imagine you have an accounting system that can see if fires happened, can work out how many tonnes of emissions went into the air, and then require compensating reductions somewhere else in the economy. Well, that accounting system would mean that forest fires have no effect on overall emissions. And that would mean the Climate Change Commission doesn't have to worry about forest fires in its models and its recommendations. A good accounting system can turn flammable trees which aren't a permanent store of carbon, into a much more secure way to meet our targets. Now, we already have an emissions accounting system, and it can do just that. It's called the Emissions Trading Scheme, and it can see when forest fires happen, it can work out how many tonnes were emitted, and it can demand that either the forest owner or someone somewhere else in the economy makes compensating reductions in response. In fact, this principle of forest fire neutrality is quite a lot more general than forest fires. In fact, it applies right across the economy. So one of the problems that I see in the Commission's whole approach is that it's focused on forest fires when it should be focused on the accounting. Okay, so let's talk about the Commission's report. It was released nearly 5 weeks ago. It's 847 pages long, and it does two things. It gives us emissions budgets, proposes emissions budgets for the next 15 years, and it sets out a plan for how and where emissions should come down all the way through to 2050. Now, the Commission's an advisory body, and this is a draft report to be finalised in the middle of the year, but the government's already said that it's going to accept whatever the Commission gives it. So if you haven't looked at what the Commission's proposing, you probably should, because it's proposing fundamental reforms across transport, energy, agriculture, forestry, public transport. It wants us to walk 25% more, and it's prepared to say that cities should be reshaped to make that happen. Rod Carr, the chair of the Commission himself, has said the plan is much more ambitious than the reforms following in the 1980s. And he's certainly right about that. I believe the Commission has made a fundamental mistake in its report, and it's this. It has chosen to pursue non-emissions objectives at the expense of its core task of lowering emissions. And we know the Commission's done that because its analysis shows it. The Commission says that with current policies and a carbon price of $50, New Zealand gets to net zero emissions in 2050. But the Commission wants to do a bunch of other things with EVs and native forests and banning gas connections and so on. And as a result, the Commission says we will pay $250 for a tonne of carbon. So think about that this way. That means 20% of the cost of the Commission's plan will go to lower emissions. The other 80% will go on other things. And of course, paying 5 times more to get to an emissions target puts that target at risk. Let's just dwell for a moment on the significance of that first finding around the $50. For $50 a tonne, New Zealand gets to net zero under current policies with the existing tools that we have, according to the Commission's estimates. The ETS price right now is $39 a tonne, forward price is $45. So it's probably too much to say that we're on track, but it's probably fair to say that we're in control and we have choices. And that's significant because it means that we don't have to transform the economy to meet our emissions targets if we choose not to. We don't have to do any of the Commission's recommendations in order to meet our obligation to deliver net zero emissions in 2050 according to their analysis. We can if we choose, but it's not necessary. So what should the Commission be doing? I think they should be focusing on the accounting. Strengthen the ETS, wrap it in checks and balances to make sure it's working and that you can catch problems as early as possible, and then go as far as you can with the best tool that we have to reduce emissions. The other thing is that I think the Commission should be much smarter about what it's trying to do with complementary policies alongside the ETS. The Commission proposes to essentially throw mud at a wall and hope everything sticks. In fact, none of it's going to work. If you've capped emissions with an ETS, other policies have no further effect on emissions. And that's not something the Commission takes nearly enough account of. The better thing to do with complementary policy is to use it to target areas that are going wrong when they go wrong. Be surgical before you go broad. Go as far as you can with the ETS and then scale up policy as and when you reach the limits of what the ETS can do. Before I finish up, I do need to say that If we're going to have a climate change commission that's more focused on emissions, that doesn't mean non-emissions issues are not important. Of course, issues around particulates, around equity, trade-offs of exotics versus native trees, they are important issues. The question is who should be deciding. What I think the right model is that the Climate Change Commission focuses on emissions. We have a Department of Conservation, we have MPI, we have a Ministry of Health, who are more than capable of dealing with these complicated trade-offs. And it makes sense to let specialisation do its work, rather than ask a Climate Change Commission who knows a lot about climate change and emissions reductions to also get into health issues, political trade-offs on land use, and so on. One objective means we can get to our targets responsibly, safely, sooner than 2050 if we take the shortest path, and we should, because it's the right thing to do. I'll leave you with 3 takeaways in conclusion. First, we agreed to cut emissions. We have not agreed to drive more electric vehicles. And there's a huge difference between those 2 things. Second, carbon is a commodity, and our targets are clear. So how are we not taking a systems approach to deliver on emissions? And how is ad hoc political whack-a-mole still on the table as an emissions strategy? And finally, a systems approach doesn't have to be an ETS, but it should be, because actually our ETS is pretty good. MFE has been building it for 20 years. They know what they're doing, and actually they need a bit of help because the Climate Change Commission has now decided to attack the ETS. It could use your support. So submissions close on the 28th of March, and I hope you'll all be making a submission. Thank you.
We could move directly to you, please, and Vicky will join us, and I'm sure she'll have more to add to that discussion, Matt. Thanks.
Kia ora. Ko Viktoria toko ingoa. My name is Victoria. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Otago in economics, and I'm an academic, so I like slides. So I've got a few slides here for you. Now, just to shine a bit of light on the mystery of my last name, it's Kahui. I was Russian-born, raised in Germany, lived in England and Norway, and finally settled in New Zealand. And married my husband, who's Maori, for now over 20 years, hence the last name. He's from Taranaki. So while at times I felt a little bit robbed of a strong national identity, I've also had the opportunity to appreciate very different cultures just by living a rather nomadic lifestyle for some time. And if it has taught me one thing, is that language matters. So in my economist training, we're trained to think and speak in a certain way. When you talk to other people from different cultures, from other disciplines, so I work with ecologists, with lawyers, what you notice is that often you have the same objectives, exactly the same outlook in life, but you use different language, and that can be a barrier. So I've called this, who owns nature's tonga? Tonga is a prized possession. It can be anything from an object to a river, a place of significance, a custom. And it's interesting because the word itself has a value judgment in it, right? It's something valuable that we should take care of. Now, sorry, I'm just trying to... Now, when you translate that into a Western scientific framework, then of course most of us are familiar with the term of ecosystem services. And I think especially, so this is taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's a framework that's now widely used all around the world. And it really focuses on describing the environment, nature, in terms of the services it provides for our human well-being. And of course, we felt this more acutely than ever during COVID-19, right? The ability to social distance, right, by having the space available, to use natural amenity to maintain our well-being, mental well-being, but also to rely on the agricultural produce, give us some sort of safety net in case there are disruptions worldwide. So these are ecosystem services, and they feed into each other. And what we have seen, what I think I've seen in the discipline of natural resource economics, is that the classic tragedy that we used to think applies to forests, land, fisheries, is now really a tragedy of the ecosystem services. In the sense, and this is a really nice example, think about it, when you own a piece of land, you own this land, so you have the property right to it. But no one owns the wetland's ability to filtrate water, to provide habitat. So it's that lack of ownership that leads to a tragedy. Now, when you think about emissions, it's a very similar picture, right? So in economics, we teach as a standard externality. Industrialization leads to CO2 emissions over time, and it's an externality because it leads to global warming. But you could also see it as a tragedy in the sense that no one owns the atmosphere's capacity to absorb and deal with greenhouse gases. It's just another way of looking at it. So when you think about it this way, you then have to start thinking about, well, how do we deal with these issues, with these tragedies? And Matt has, of course, talked about the ETS. That's one way, right? We can have very strong property rights, and it's the preferred way by a lot of economists. And New Zealand has a very good history with that, especially in the fisheries context. So I used to be a fisheries economist. I used to do a lot of modeling, looking at the property rights, and especially the individual transferable quota system in New Zealand. And I always say to my students when I teach them, I say, well, New Zealand is the least worst at managing fisheries. And I say this because most other countries are in a much worse state than we are. So assigning a strong property right, the right to fish a certain amount of a certain species in a certain area in a certain time and be able to trade that has led to the efficiency result we often want, right? We get the most effective fishers catching a certain amount of fish. And that's a very similar kind of mechanism for the ETS. But when we set these incentives, we incentivize the most efficient way to fish. Now that happens to be often for deep sea species, for example, bottom trawling. Bottom trawling itself, of course, has the unintended consequence that it destroys the benthic habitat. So here we have a classic tragedy of the ecosystem services again, right? So we have controlled one part of the system and inadvertently affected another part. And then we have regulation and taxes. So these are the economist's toolbox. This is the stuff we teach our students, right? And regulations are important. They all have their places, so do taxes. And it's in no way to say we should throw these away, quite the opposite. We should embrace them, but we have to move on. And I'd like to say, we're in the 21st century. We need 21st century economics, not 20th century economics. So we need to use these tools, but in a wider and newer institutional setting. So the way I started thinking about this is that I was very inspired by Ostrom. So Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And she studied bottom-up organizations around the world, communities that managed their commons, their ecosystem services, so to speak, by themselves without any government intervention. She came up with this framework, what made these institutions successful. And that's what won her the Nobel Prize. And it's a fantastic book if anyone is ever interested in reading it. But what struck me when I read her book, I was like, well, it was nearly like a backward-looking exercise in the sense that what she identified was these small communities that are very, similar in their way of thinking and their way of acting, that have a lot of trust, right? So it applies to that setting. What we face today, of course, is a very different kind of environment. And this is by the recent report by the New Zealand Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment highlighted this more than ever. So this report focused on estuaries, right? And this is a little map of it's a little bit fuzzy here, but it's of the Porirua catchment area. And it shows you all that this is, I think a council policy person has drawn this, senior policy analyst, and it shows you all the overlapping jurisdiction, the different policies, the multitude of stakeholders, people who want to practice mahinga kai versus some other people who want to use the estuary for access or transport versus using it for effluence or recreation, right? It's these complex stakeholder interactions. And this is really what I think the frontier is now. How do we manage these trade-offs, just like Ellen Board said, you can't just put a bottom line there. That's not a trade-off, right? You have to have some sort of facility or some ability for stakeholders to get to some solution. And I was inspired when I came across Jacinta Ruru. She's a professor at the University of Otago, and she's worked on this extensively. And in 2017, the Whanganui River declared itself, or was granted, legal personhood. So here's another language issue. So when I talk to my husband or others about this, they immediately feel like, well, how, what do you mean by legal person? So if you look at that concept, legal personhood, it applies to humans. Humans are legal persons, but they're also non-human entities, namely the corporation, right? The firm, the corporation, is a legal entity. It can enter a contract, it can own property, it can incur debt, it can be sued, it can sue, right? And it took, since medieval times, for that idea to really evolve and be accepted. And it's led to one of the most wealth-creating structures that we know. So when I read about this, the Whanganui River, which was recognized as an indivisible living whole comprising the Whanganui River from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements, I was a little bit inspired. I thought, wow, so here we have a new institutional arrangement. And the way it works, and this is something that I'm currently a little bit looking into, and I'm keen to actually engage with some of the people involved when this was created, is that it has a human face. Right? So the human face is represented by Whanganui Iwi, the Crown, as well as an advisory group. And that advisory group is made up of recreational fishers, of Genesis, of anyone, or the council, anyone who has a stake or some utilization interest in that river. And the explicit aim is to act collaboratively. Right? It is to actually sit down at the table and come to these trade-offs. Now, in the legislation, and this is my last slide for you today, it very clearly states that the overarching aim is to preserve the intrinsic value of the river. Now, this is something that economists really struggle with. Right? I mean, as an environmental economist, we teach our students total economic value, use and non-use values. It's always this very strong anthropocentric worldview. So here we have an intrinsic value, an inherent value. And what we've seen when you look at the valuation literature and you ask people, you go out and say, what are you willing to pay to preserve this particular natural entity? What you find is people do put some willingness to pay on intrinsic value, right? It's a strange or unexpected result. But here we have Te Ao Maori, right? Some ancient knowledge, some Motoranga Maori that can inform what we may need for 21st century policy making. So the interesting bit here is about, if you've followed this presentation, is about property rights, right? So we've gone from no one owns something, leading to a tragedy, to very strong property rights in terms of tradability. And here we have now a property right that's vested in the resource itself. And this is something I struggled with, right? It made me really think. I was like, what does that mean? It's something vested in the resource itself. It's its own entity. And we have these stakeholders around it who are able to negotiate. And this is when I have now come across I've always thought Coase was one of the most impressive economists, even nearly notching above Adam Smith, but Coase was brilliant. If you read some of his work, he was talking about transaction costs, right? Transaction costs matter because they inform what institutions and what type of institutions are forming. So new institutional economics, for example, would say if the transaction costs of a particular way of being become so high that they're unworkable, we switch to a new institutional arrangement. I'm not saying we all need to think about legal personhood or environmental personhood for natural systems, but what I'm saying is we need to think about new institutional arrangements if we're thinking about transaction costs. And I think Ellen Bollard mentioned we should, there's some thinking about aggregation. Maybe that is the first step to it, right? But what we want to do, and this is interesting, there's an academic, Julia Talbot-Jones, who did her thesis on the some of these transaction costs. You used a little game theory experiment to see whether they increase or decrease. And of course, when you move to a new institutional arrangement, transaction costs increase, right? Quite clearly, you have to implement a new system, you have to renegotiate water usage rights, let's say. But what struck me as interesting is the Whanganui iwi had gone to court for centuries trying to get their right to be heard. And that, when you look back at codes, is also a transaction cost. It's about delineating, defining, and capturing a property right, right? Because it's when transaction costs are high, this is when negotiation fails, right? So when you take that into account, it kind of inspired me to think, well, is this not something we actually see in this current climate change movement, right? We see the Generation Zero, we see young people who are really arguing on behalf of the resource, of our natural systems, as a way to create resilience in terms of climate change, right? But they have no voice. There's no property right for them, right? So is it their way of arguing on behalf of that system? And we need to get them as a stakeholder on the table. Maybe this is a way forward. But I think I would like to leave you with this is we need 21st century economics to deal with 21st century problems. So we need to think about new institutions and the way we can make them work effectively. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. And we've got Vicky all good to go, I think. Vicky, are you? Great. Great to have you with us. We'll let you get straight into your presentation. Thanks, Vicky.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Vicky Robertson aho, ko te tumu whakaere mō te taio. So I'm the Secretary for the Environment. My name's Vicky Robertson. I didn't hear you, Matt, initially, so you were telling stories from our times together a few years ago, I'm sure. And I didn't hear all of your conversation around the Climate Commission's budgets, but I can imagine some of the flavour of that. I find myself agreeing both with you and Victoria. And I suppose the question I pose today for the audience is how might we have an economy that works for people and planet? I came, as Matt indicated, from Treasury and trotted across the road to the Ministry for the Environment some 6 years ago now. And I have to tell you, I was probably a little naive to the degradation of our environment. And our environment report in 2019 points out 9 areas that are top priorities where not only is our environment degrading, but the trend is not good. And I suppose I was a little bit shocked by that and a little bit in the frame of, well, if we leave the market or we leave private citizens to work out what they need to do, then they will do what is necessary. And I think I've learned that we are building on that kind of thinking to new ways of thinking, like you say, Victoria, and also learning from old ways of thinking. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But the evidence on New Zealand's environment is not good. And I implore you to go and have a look at our own data on that. The thing that I think is important about that is our whole economic prosperity relies, well, a lot of it does, relies on our natural environment. So the nexus between the economy and the environment is really strong in New Zealand, as is, I think, more so now, the nexus we're seeing between people well-being and the environment and being able to get out in nature and have access to nature and in that way as well. And we saw that through COVID. So the evidence isn't good. So probably we need different ways of thinking about things from here. If otherwise, we will continue to degrade what we rely on as people. The other part that kind of has changed for me in my own thinking is just we did behave as if the environment and the economy were separate things. And the classical economics would say, the environment is an externality and we'll deal with it in that way. And I think we've moved in New Zealand and also around the world to realizing that's probably not quite the way that we might deal with the complexity of these issues going forward. Maori, of course, and Indigenous people have known this for centuries, and the interconnectedness and the interrelationship between living and non-living things has been part of the way that they think about things. And you see that coming through in some of the ways Maori businesses are thinking about their own plans in that connection. Our own Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, he said recently it's no longer reasonable or credible to organise our economy and society on a basis that regards natural capital as infinitely substitutable. And I think there's something really important in that. So that substitutability piece is quite clear. I think the other part I would say about this, which I think has been very important for us and is in our role, is that action or change on the ground today isn't seen until a long time in the future, both negative and positive. So the intergenerational benefits and costs are really important in thinking about any change that we make to environmental outcomes and the impact on the economy at the moment. And at the moment, I know, Matt, you talked about the climate commissions. You know, one of the critical things for us is to understand what that long-term both benefits and costs to those pathways, not just the short-term costs to current generations. And I think that's really important. So the challenge we've got as a goal is really how do we move to where we have the economy, environment working together, and we reverse, not just do less degradation, but we also invest because nature has a really important role to play in our economic prosperity. It has value for its sake, and Victoria talked about the intrinsic value of nature. In our freshwater reforms last year, there is a hierarchy around how we think about freshwater now in New Zealand, and the first water call is back to the awa, back to the river, and their purposes and then economic purposes. So that hierarchy made into our national policy statement and how we will think about water from here on in. So we've got the beginnings and the building of some different thinking, some different ways of approaching that. Victoria, which I sit on that group that you talked about. So there's something emerging here in New Zealand that we can build on. I think the intergenerational piece really takes us into a way, probably my breeding ground and treasury, which was really strongly neoclassical economics and better tools. I think 21st century tools, as you talked about, Victoria, and probably a massive point about ETS. And it recognises that, things are complex and are connected and actually you have to deal with that complexity and the dynamic efficiency, if you like, in an economic sense, but also the intergenerational. So what is the impacts in the long term? I think that is emerging globally. So Mariana Mazzucato, we have done some with at the moment. I'm really interested in her thinking, and she's advising the OECD and governments around the world. Governments are already involved in a whole lot of investment, and I think she challenges how you might achieve that dynamic change over time, and really challenges the underlying theory of what we value and the public value and the government's role in creating that model for the environment over time. There's a real opportunity, I think, as I said, for New Zealand. Of course, there are, as Victoria said, we build on existing toolbox in our economic toolbox, probably have an important role to play, but they are really pricing the bads, and they won't by itself really affect the system change that we think is required in terms of that the environmental degradation. Quite a blunt tool. For example, Sweden's had a really high price on carbon for decades, over US $100, but their electric vehicle market share is under 10%. Norway's by comparison, has a success with EV market share of new vehicles nearly at 50%, and they put in because of key policies around EVs being cheaper to buy than ICEs. So I suppose in summary of that is, I think it's a mix of tools. The ETS will only get us so far, and probably the pace and timing of change just using one tool is not going to be effective. I think creating effective institutions is really important, Victoria, and changing expectations about what they might deliver. For example, as an example of the way firms are bringing in climate risk, that we are moving to mandatory disclosure of climate-related financial risks for firms. Something that, climate change is being considered something that government does. Well, this is coming onto firms' own books and also within their boardrooms. So directly changing private investment behaviour. The New Zealand Green Investment Fund was established to play a role modelling, mobilising some of the private sector financing into low emission solutions, recognising that if you just left it to a short-term market-based approach, that firms will probably never invest in the things that we need to get us on the path to a low emissions future. And the Climate Commission itself is an institution that is set up to provide independent advice based on the science. It has it's a UK-based model, so it's independent from us, and we now are once they give their advice, we will be providing advice to the government on the pathways that they have recommended. The thing that's different in the institutional sense, and this is important too, is under the legislation, the government can't say thanks very much for your advice, Climate Commission. We'll ignore that and do something else. They have to come up with a plan, and that recognises that there isn't we can do nothing here. There needs to be a pathway set out for everybody in the economy to look over the 5-year budget, and that gives investors certainty and to allow to see, for us all to see what that pathway might look like. So those are some examples of how changes in the institutions have happened. So in summary, I think new tools in the toolbox is important. I think New Zealand has a unique opportunity with Maori and Indigenous ways of thinking, and already different ways of setting up how we think about the connection between nature and the economy, that we can actually find ways that works for us. With an economy that relies very heavily on nature and a people that relies very heavily on nature, then we are, there's a responsibility on all of us to think outside the square here, a way of making sure that is there for future generations. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thanks so much, Vicky, for joining us online. We lost you a wee bit in the middle there, so it wasn't quite perfect, I'm sorry. It's a good reminder of just how important infrastructure is, including infrastructure that facilitates us communicating across long distances. Great perspectives there, some differences, some overlaps, some similarities in perspectives, new ways of thinking, yes, but Matt will remind us, let's also make sure that people use their comparative advantage, or organisations use their comparative advantage. Do we have any questions from the floor first? Okay, let me move to a question for all three of you, please, and hopefully Vicky can hear us and can join in if she has a response as well. How should we manage the trade-off between necessary infrastructure development and the environment? So that follows on very nicely from Alan's presentation.
We should price carbon.
Well, that's a nice, simple answer, Matt.
We should do it competently and on a level playing field, and as cheaply and as efficiently as possible.
Thanks, nice and simple. Vicky, have we still got Vicky with us? Yeah, Vicky, what do you think? Any response? on how we should manage the trade-offs between
I'd say yes and to Matt. So and think about prioritising that towards a low emissions future. So is that built into the decision making? From where I sit, will infrastructure actually deliver better emissions reductions, then also very important in decision making.
Thanks, Vicky. Victoria, any comments?
I fully agree with Matt.
Good decision.
Okay, and another question for all of our panellists. Are there examples of ETS programs leading to significant carbon reductions?
Yes, there are. Please go.
I would disagree. So this is something we've discussed in the car. So it's not my research area, and I might have missed it, but from when I was in Europe, I got the distinct impression that most carbon markets didn't work so well, precisely because there was always that often the cap was set way too high, or it was enforced in ways that allowed people to do things that didn't actually lead to carbon emissions reductions. And one prime example I've mentioned was in New Zealand, purchasing dodgy carbon credits from the Ukraine to meet our targets for quite some time after the EU had decided that that was not a viable way of going. So I've made the point to Matt that we really, when we want to introduce an ETS, we need a really stable, secure institution that is willing to actually set a lower cap and really stick with it and send the right signals to investors. Because if they start investing and the government keeps changing its its tech on it or its regulations, that is too much uncertainty. And I've seen that in the ITQ system where the government has done it and it's worked really well, right? It's anchored in the legislation. You can take your mortgage out on your quota. So that's provide very strong signals.
Yeah, completely agree. So look, the Ukrainian credits debacle, it should be seen for what it was, a serious problem, but not a fundamental problem that can't be avoided next time. Absolutely agree. It all hinges on quality of institutions. Nobody can have confidence in a system that's printing fake credits and pretending that means something. There is evidence on the evidence of ETSs. The first thing to say is that it's hard to see decentralised systems work, right? All the changes and emissions reductions occur in places that you can't see. That's how prices work. There are studies, there's two things I'd say. There's studies from overseas. Prices have gone up a lot here in New Zealand and overseas over the last 5 years. That's had real consequences on the ground. Overseas studies make very clear that even at quite low prices, there's been a real effect. In the UK, Britain's electricity sector, 55% reduction in emissions from their electricity sector over 5 years to 2018, mostly from coal to gas conversions in generation plants. More than half of that was due to an ETS, according to a study that came out just before Christmas. Here in New Zealand, when you talk to energy companies and others that are exposed to a carbon price, they all say to you, we are absolutely making different decisions on the back of the higher costs that we're facing to burn coal. One final point, at $39 a tonne of coal, the price of a tonne of coal is nearly doubled by the ETS, right? That hurts. Natural gas up 25 to 30%. Similarly important in the other direction, consequences in forestry. So it may not have a major effect on the price of petrol, but don't let that, that doesn't mean that it's not having a big effect elsewhere.
So the prices are working, the markets are working. And Vicky, if you're with us, if we could draw you in on this as well, and there was a specific question for you, what's your view on Matt's argument that we should treat this as a market problem solved through pricing of carbon?
So we would say that you need more than the ETS, for a number of reasons, one of which is the distributional impacts of having just a pricing mechanism. The second is the speed of change. So we would argue that you need complementary measures in place, and that you can't just rely on price to to affect the change that's required over the time that is required.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Can I ask, Vicky, your view? I mean, do you agree that we should be checking the effectiveness of everything we're doing, ETS, complementary policies, and be prepared to stop doing what's not effective and do more of what is effective?
I do agree, and I think there is a sufficiency question in everything that we do. So what is going to take us towards actually lowering emissions, as I think you pointed out, and what are the, so I think there is often decisions made that are very short term to do something that actually doesn't necessarily would have a different alternative or a different policy that we might put in place that gets us towards lower emissions. And I think transport's the hardest one, right? There is a behavioural change in transport that is required, and the question is, how do you affect that? New Zealand's one of the highest in the OECD in terms of our transport emissions, and they're growing. We love our cars. So I think there's a question about, between the different policy options that you've got, what is the best and the most efficiency, what's going to work the best in terms of changing behaviour about our move out of petrol vehicles, basically. So the short answer is yes, but I wouldn't rely on a price tool only.
And there's an associated question on transport that's come through from online. Is increasing the number of electric vehicles or reducing emissions what we're targeting? Are electric vehicles a public policy aim in their own right? So Vicky, I don't know if you want to jump back in and make any response on that one.
Yeah, I think one of the things the Commission has done is point out that to actually get a lower emissions profile in transport, we actually have to change the way that we travel. And so thinking about mobility and also, I'm not sure, how cities are designed. So they do talk about increasing other mobility. So cycling, walking is probably a pathway towards different ways of travelling.
Thanks.
I would just, I think we're sort of, there's two objective functions in here. And I just, I guess, say that, if you're solving for lower emissions, you've got to choose between solving for lower emissions or solving for transport emissions. And if you're doing one, you're not doing the other. And so in the end, the text of our agreement says we've made a commitment to lower emissions. We have to be aware, I think, and I say this humbly, that if we are going to decide that we want to pursue lower transport emissions per se, which is what I think Vicky just said, that is at the expense, or makes it harder, to get to net zero, because you're eliminating competition, you're closing off the options and forcing emissions through this channel. Now that's fine if it turns out transport is or will become a competitive source of emissions reductions. As Vicky said, right now it's actually pretty hard. EVs are getting much more competitive in the future, but right now that's hard. And in the end, if you want to insist on forcing emissions reductions through transport today, it makes it harder to get to what we said we'd do, which is net zero in 2050.
Eric, do you want to go ahead?
Great, I've got a couple questions. One is a follow-on for Minister for the Environment, Vicky there. Completely take the point on equity issues. It would seem a second best, though, to try and approach equity issues by jolting things around in the ETS or addressing complementary measures when there are first best alternatives available. The government auctions NZU. They get money when they auction NZU. You could take the pot of money, divide it by 5 million people, send everybody a check at the end of the year as a carbon dividend that will almost certainly be a progressive transfer because rich people spend more money on everything. Carbon is in everything. So this will turn into something that would reinforce the system. I worry that the complementary measures that you seem to be endorsing and that Rod Carr certainly is endorsing will break the system, make it politically fragile, and make it way harder for us to get there. Have you done any work looking at potential equity, the potential use of carbon dividends in addressing equity and embedding the ETS? And I'll save my other one for Victoria, which I loved your talk. I'll chat offline later.
Go ahead, Vicky. I'm not sure whether Vicky heard that question there. It might be one that we need to leave till later. She's disappearing on us.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Look, this is something you hear often, that the ETS has dispreferred distributional outcomes, and we have to worry. Of course, we have to worry about that. But I do have a question of, how distributionally advantageous does policy have to be to make up for a 5 or 10 or 50-fold deficit in terms of the number of dollars you have to spend to achieve a given amount of reductions? Wouldn't it just be cheaper to go for the $1 option and then use some of the savings, and hopefully a small amount, to fix whatever the most affordable option broke? You've got to remember that an affordable way to cut carbon is affordable for a reason. It's because it does the least disruption. It consumes the least resources. And so you wouldn't normally anticipate that to be particularly distributionally disadvantageous, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure it's ever been demonstrated that the ETS is worse in distribution terms. But even if it is, we can still use it if it's the most effective way to do things, and have adjusting policies on the side that make up for whatever problems the ETS created. We don't have to do this separate approach of giving up our best tool on a theoretical argument, because that's all it is, that policy can do a better job on distribution.
I don't know that much about ETS, but I can draw on the fisheries example. And when New Zealand in the 80s, early 90s, adopted the ITQ system, it had huge distributional impacts. But New Zealand was quite open-minded to them and said, well, we'll just throw the chips and see how they lie. And they didn't redistribute. And over time, what we saw was a real change and unanticipated change in how these quota were redistributed. So we saw a huge concentration of quota in the most efficient hands, which are typically big corporations, away from local fishermen. And that's why most other countries in the world have some sort of restrictions on the tradability of these rights, precisely for that reason. They want to preserve some of their local fisheries tradition in, for example, the Norwegian coast. They want to make sure that local employment is sustained. And while the ETS is arguably quite different to fisheries, in some sense it's very similar, because what you're doing is you're allocating rights, and yes, you get the most effective reduction in your CO2 emissions. This is what you want, but it will have an effect on winners and losers, and that's always the case. And then you have to really start thinking about, is this something, or what is it? How do we want to deal with that?
And I think you can use systems to protect the things you care about. It's not just dollars and tons of, there are interests, there are all kinds of interests that can be recognised in a system that gives credible, permanent, enduring protection to the things we care about. It's not just dollars and tons. It's, there are human factors in there that can be brought in. And it's great because if it's in a system, it's not subject to the whims of the next government or the next election or whatever. You have security.
Thanks, and I guess we'll move on to another question. We have lost Vicky, I'm sorry, so we'll just address this question to the two, but I think probably, Victoria, you might make the first response on this question. How do Maori aspirations fit with the Climate Commission's proposals? And then we'll let Matt...
Well, what struck me this is probably one of the most pervasive arguments for me for looking at some Maori values, is that they really care about future generations. They're really focusing on what we bequest, what we pass on to future generations. And it's a really central way of thinking, and climate change is all about that, because we're now realizing that whatever impact, whatever we do now has some impact further down the line for our children, or for, even if we don't have children, the future generations, our species. And it's a really important concept that I think Maori are very good at addressing, and we're starting to get good at this, right? I think it's coming now to the forefront of our thinking. But it's been always there with the Maori way of looking at the world. And I think that's something we really need to take on board, right? What we're doing now is having a huge impact, and we need to be very careful about that.
At the risk of oversimplifying everything, I just have this view that in the end, everybody wins when you're achieving a given goal for the smallest commitment of resources, for the least risk, with the most certainty and so on. And that you're doing it in a way that isn't subject to, what side of bed a particular official in a particular department got out of this morning. So I would just say that I think everybody wins. Everything's better when you're doing things in an organised, clear way.
Thanks. Are there any last questions from the floor? Otherwise, I'm going to ask one more of our online questions before we break for lunch. Who should be judging the merits of different climate change mitigation options? Isn't that central planning overreach? I might have an idea of what Matt's response on this is, but who would like to start on that?
You could start on this. I have to think about it.
Well, look, I think it touches on the question: what are the decisions we want government doing, and what are the decisions we want businesses and households making? And so, in the end, the discussion we've had today with Vicky, I think, has been the question of: do we want government doing just the accounting, or do we want the government choosing between different technologies and different sectors? Governments are really good at accounting systems in all forms, including our ETS, but all over the place, government budget systems and so on. Governments are demonstrably, measurably bad and persistently on really complicated questions like technology. And it's not because, any ill intent, not lack of competence. It's just hard to make those judgments from the centre. And to the extent possible, you want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. You want 1 million decision makers making those trade-offs, not 100 in Wellington somewhere. So you want to, the reason the Commission is building these enormously complicated models, very difficult tasks, they're doing, they've got a competent team in there, they're working hard, we can see that. But in the end, the reason it's so hard for them is because they're doing the wrong job. They're taking on a job that really should be in the hands of households and businesses for them to decide how much more they love their V8 versus their gas heater. That's they know that a lot better than well-meaning officials in Wellington. So, ask the government to do the accounting and do it really well and do their homework to make sure it's working. Step in if it's not, and otherwise trust households and businesses to understand their preferences. And that what you'll find is it gets a whole lot easier to get to our emissions targets.
Great, nice, simple response, as always. Victoria,
Well, I've been kind. I was thinking about that question. Let the science do the talking. I mean, what we've seen is a massive decline in natural degradation of our waterways and many other ecosystem services. And we're measuring this, we're monitoring this. And in fact, the report, New Zealand parliamentary report, really focused on monitoring, right? Not only let's manage this as a single identity, but also monitor it. So it's a bit like, let's try and do things and see what happens, right? If we start, I mean, a lot of it is very common sense, but if we start replanting native vegetation, that's much better at CO2 absorption. We know that a lot of that goes through in the riparian rights. If we start doing that and we see a massive improvement in water quality, that's a good thing. So we need science. Science is absolutely crucial. We need that monitoring, that baseline to see where we started and where we go. And I think, I mean, it may not be always the best way, the most effective way, but we are in some way fumbling our ways through this. And what economics has to offer is that it's not the end and all, but it gives you some way of thinking about things in a more effective way. How can we have a win-win? That's what we all want, right? How can we do the right things in the most efficient way? And how can we approach these stakeholder trade-offs with the least cost possible? That is really the mantra of all economic thought. And underpinning it should be a safe, sound science level, right? And some good work showing that we're going in the right direction.
Thanks very much. And that response reminded me of some of the discussions yesterday on COVID, where, yeah, we need the good science, but we probably also need some good economics thrown in there as well to help those make those trade-offs really clear, what we're doing. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to close this panel. It's been an excellent panel, hasn't it? Lots of insights. Sorry about the little tech hitches with Vicky there, but thanks for bearing with us. And thanks very much for our in-person panellists, and to Vicky, thanks very much for joining us as well.
Thank you.